So I apologize for two things. I apologize for my lack of German language skills, but I'm at the point in my life now where it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, so please forgive me on that. And I apologize for the weather, because this feels just like Washington, D.C. in the summertime, which is to say awful. So I guess I feel right at home. But I'm really thankful that Torben invited me to be here, and I'm looking forward to a good night's sleep tonight, which I've not had the last few nights, because every night for the last 3 nights I've had crazy Irishmen singing Will Griggs on Fire outside my apartment in Paris. So it's going to be nice to get to sleep without that tonight. So I want to also preface this by saying sometimes when I get excited I talk very quickly, and I apologize in advance if that happens, but I've prepared a presentation that has a number of charts and things that you can look at, so if you can't understand my quick talking, then you can hopefully get the message from what's going on. So, oh, you know what, let me get my thing. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So we're talking about America's populist moment, and it won't come as a surprise to anybody here in this room who studies European politics to know that there's a strain of populism going around the world right now. You've got a lot of it here in Europe, really all over the world. There's a real sense, it almost sort of feels like the world is kind of sliding into entropy, that there's the center's not holding anymore. There's a lack of order and predictability. The post-war political and economic consensus is really fraying, and this emboldens the political extremes. And so, populism is the plat du jour, as my French friends from the other day would say. But why is it happening in the U.S., where all the most of the economic indicators are good? Immigration is very low. Along that line, we've had 70 consecutive months of private sector job growth under President Obama. Look, Torben, I brought a pointer so you can see. So the recession of 2009, 2008, 2009 stretched over to here, and then really ever since about the beginning of 2010 in the United States, every single month has had private sector job growth. So the economy's in good shape, right? And usually people like, the way things are going when the economy's in good shape. Contrary to what some political figures in the Republican Party would tell you, we actually have very low net immigration at this point, which is obviously something different in the US from what's going on here in Europe. And as you see that immigration from Mexico, which is where most of the immigrants come from, peaked right before the recession in 2009. But ever since then, and really under Obama, we've had net negative immigration in the United States, which, again, these are the facts that actually run counter to what some of the Republicans who run for president want people to think, because they're sort of trying to sow this sense of fear that, the immigrants are coming, they're going to take your jobs. But it's really just not happened that way. So I want to talk about tonight, what are some of the underlying factors that are causing this kind of populist stew in American politics? We're going to start by looking at the conservative side, and then we're going to talk about the progressive, or as we say, liberal side in the US, and then we'll talk about what sort of non-political factors are affecting everyone. We'll look along the lines at the rise of Donald Trump, and then Bernie Sanders, whose campaign I was fortunate enough to work on. So we'll talk about sort of 3 basic sets of trends that have been happening in our country over the last 6 to 8 years, starting with the economy. I don't want to belabor too much on this because I'm not an economist. I work in politics, and they could have a whole lecture on the effects, after effects of the recession and globalization in America. But just a couple quick things. The recession that we had in 2008, 2009 really hit lower middle income white men particularly hard. They've also been buffeted over the last generation with the loss of the manufacturing sector in America, which is, there's a lot of job losses that have happened among what we call blue-collar white men, which are, people who work in heavy manufacturing and industry. And then we've also had stagnating wages, which really lead to falling incomes. And you see here the loss of US manufacturing jobs dating back to 1980. And we've had a 37% decrease in manufacturing sector jobs from 1980 until last year. So that's, that's real pain for a lot of people. And obviously that's not just because of the recession. Globalization has a lot to do with that as well. But these, the effects of the recession were already being felt by a number of people who live in, rural or small town America, in the Middle West, or in some areas of the South, like where I'm from. There was a recent survey by the Federal Reserve, which is a government body, that showed that almost half of Americans would struggle to come up with $400 in the event of a personal financial emergency, which is a really jarring figure when you think about it. That this $400, that might mean your car broke down, or you might have had some sort of catastrophic illness, or your kids might have gotten sick or something. And the fact that almost half of our country would struggle to come up with $400 in an event of emergency is a pretty dire thing. So there's plenty of uncertainty among a large section of Americans. They really feel like they have lost out on the American dream. This sense that, if you work hard, Bill Clinton always used to say, if you work hard and play by the rules, that you'll do better than your parents did. That there's sort of always a rising standard of living in America. And there's a real sense among a lot of people in America that we've sort of lost touch with that. So let's talk about some cultural trends, because particularly if you're a conservative-leaning or small-town person in America, the last 7 or 8 years have been pretty difficult for you culturally. We've had, we elected, as he used to say, Barack Obama used to say himself, a tall, skinny black guy with a funny-sounding name. Not once, but twice. And a lot of people, even though, of course, in 2008 there was so much optimism around his campaign, by 2012 and going through the recession, a lot of sort of middle Americans had decided that they'd had enough. But he won again, and he won basically on the strength of growing segments of the electorate which are younger, more diverse, and the rising impact of minority voters in American life. So there's a couple of charts here, but I just want to talk about this one, and then this one. So if you see, what's been happening is that America has been getting browner and more diverse. The percentage of the population that's white, which was 85% back in the 1950s, has shrunk, and we've had increasing gains among African Americans and then particularly Hispanics. And here we are right here, and it's going to continue. Why is it going to continue? Because you see in this one here that the orange represents the population by age group, percent of total of Hispanics in America. The blue represents Anglos or whites. And you see that there are a lot more Hispanics that are younger, and the whites are older. So this means that this trend is only going to continue. America is growing more diverse, not just Hispanic, although it's the fastest growing minority group, but also among Asian Americans as well. So America has a changing face. It looks more like President Obama, actually, and this is disturbing for a lot of white people. You see this right here, nearly 1 million US-born Hispanics reach voting age every year. So we'll look at another map here, and I like this one because, so I'm from there, Charleston, South Carolina, which is a lovely place, if you ever get a chance to go there. Washington, have you been? Oh, of course you have. Washington, D.C. is here. What this shows us is the areas where the Hispanic population has been growing the fastest, the darker, these are counties in America. And so the dark counties mean that the growth has been up to or over 75% in Hispanics since the year 2000. And then the lighter areas are where the growth of Hispanics has been under 75%. But largely these lighter areas are places where Hispanics were already quite numerous. What we see here is that the heaviest growth in the Hispanic population are in areas that never had them before, such as the southeast in the country. Florida, this part of Florida has always been fairly heavily Cuban, but this part of Florida wasn't. This is the South, where you had whites and you had African Americans, and now you have a large percentage of Hispanics as well, and then also in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. So, and really, let's think about it. More than 75% increase in the number of Hispanics in the last 15 years. I mean, that's amazing in this many counties around America. We also have, last year, the US Supreme Court basically ratified gay marriage. And now, really, this year, we're seeing the recognition of transgender rights by the federal government. This image here would have been absolutely unthinkable just a few years ago. I mean, this was 2015. I think in 2013, when Obama ran for re-election in 2012, this image would have been unthinkable. So the pace of change in America has been very, very fast. Here's another example. We have decriminalized marijuana in 21 states, and more is on the way because of ballot initiatives this fall. And I would say probably by the year 2024, already a majority of Americans live in jurisdictions where marijuana is decriminalized. And that's a huge shift from 10 years ago. But I would say in the next 8 years that it'll probably be 3/4 of the country will live. There will be some states that just will never go for it. But look, even Mississippi has decriminalized marijuana, and that's pretty crazy. My state, South Carolina, not gonna happen. But if you're an older, white, sort of middle income or lower middle income person, all this change over the last 8 or 9 years is really scary. Like, it really jars people to their cores. Let's talk a little bit now about millennials. A lot of the folks in this room, I suspect, are born between the years of 1981 and 1996. Millennials in our country tend to be more progressive. They're diverse, as we've already seen in that statistic about the number of percentage of the population that's Hispanic under the age of 40. Millennials are younger, diverse, tolerant, progressive. They're activists. They get engaged in not just politics, but in trying to make the world a better place, and they're reaching their political maturity right now. What we've had sort of a baby boom, and millennials are now, as of this year, tied with baby boomers for the largest section of the American population. This is not just voters, this is everybody. And they're going to continue to rise for the next 20 years or so. So this generation of people that are in their college years now, or their immediate post-college years, they're reaching political, economic maturity at this time when President Obama has been the president of the country, but at the same time, a number of their parents and grandparents have seen changes that they've not been very comfortable with. Millennials are now growing as a share of the electorate as well. Obviously, if they're getting bigger in the whole population, they're going to do the same with the voting electorate. So in 2008, millennials made up a little under a quarter of the American electorate. Today, they make up over a third. And they tend to vote progressive and democratic when they vote. We'll see, I'll show you a little bit later, that the turnout with millennials isn't great. So while all this has been happening, the face of republicanism has evolved from this in the 1950s and 60s. This is the Beaver-Cleaver family. Republicanism in the middle part to later part of the 20th century in America was basically an upper middle class, suburban, white, 2 kids and a dog family thing that was dominant in places like suburban New York City, Westchester County, New York, suburban Philadelphia, suburban Washington, Franklin County, Ohio, which is Columbus, Ohio, the capital of Ohio, even all the way out into the west. I do a fair bit of work in Texas, Dallas County, Texas, which you would expect would be pretty Republican. It's not. Dallas County is Democratic. It has been since 2006. They haven't elected a countywide Republican since 2006 in Dallas County. Even further west in the Pacific Northwest, places like the suburbs of Portland and Seattle used to be Republican. Not anymore. This is what Republicanism looks like today. Which is a little over-dramatized. These guys are, this is actually a reality show. It's called Duck Dynasty. This is a family that lives in Louisiana. They're big into hunting, guns. They have these big long beards. What's on their face is like, it's like war paint because they're going hunting and they want to be invisible to the animals. But they love their guns. They're very culturally conservative. They live in rural areas of the country, or they live in small towns where the population is declining. And this is what republicanism looks like today. It's not this anymore. It's more like this. So the base of the Republican Party has become whiter, older, and more rural than the country at large. These people feel a sense of loss. They feel like that America has sort of slipped away from them, both economically and culturally, and they want to make it great again, for them anyway, because the foundation of conservatism in America has been destroyed and replaced with a new base. It's not the same. It's not your father's Republican Party or your grandfather's Republican Party. So, and this leads us to talk about some political trends that have popped up on the Republican side. Basically, so to match all those cultural trends, Republicanism has become, by its definition, obstinate, intransigent, uncompromising, and this is both in Washington, D.C. and in the states. They really have no interest in working with Democrats, particularly not Obama. And the reason for this is because, this is going to get a little esoteric, but you know, I work a lot in congressional elections and state legislative elections around the country. And the electoral district maps are drawn by state legislatures. State legislatures are now majority Republican. I'll show you a chart in just a minute about what's happened under Obama at this level of government. So Republicans control the state legislatures, which draw the electoral maps for both states and Congress. And their interest is in maximizing their control, because they've seen these trends too, by the way. They know what's happening. And so they are very concerned, and they're holding on to their power however they can, which basically now is by, you know, map making. So this next slide, I'm going to, did I skip one? Here we go. So this is what's happened under President Obama in terms of the loss of U.S. Senate seats, U.S. House seats, governors, state legislative seats, and state legislative chambers. So historically, the out party, meaning the party that's not the president's party, does lose up and down the ballot during the terms of the president. But it's been pretty unprecedented under Obama. And this is the big number right here that affects what I was just telling you about, that the Democrats have lost 913 state legislative seats around the country since Obama's been president. What that does is it empowers the Republicans to draw those district maps to be even more favorable to Republicans, which means they will be even less inclined to compromise with Democrats. And it increases the importance of primary and nominating contests. So like, you know, we just went through this big process where the Republicans had a big primary process and the Democrats had a big primary process. But this happens in every year, every election, not just presidential in America, where the parties basically choose their candidates. And because these districts have become hyper partisanized or hyper polarized, they're either very controlled by Republicans or very controlled by Democrats. What happens is the primaries become more important. That's where the real action is in elections. Because if you're in a district that's 68% Republican, the general election where the Republican faces a Democrat is no contest. The Republican's going to win every time. So what happens is the primary becomes more important. And who votes in primaries? A very small number of really hyped up partisan activists. And on the Republican side, these are people who think that Obama wasn't born in America, right? Or think that Obama is a Muslim. And so what happens is that if you're an elected Republican, you have to go out to your right to make sure you don't get beat in a primary in order to hold on to your seat. Whereas it used to be that the general election served as a check. So like you had to go before, you know, the broad majority of the electorate in your district and say, well, this is why I think you should reelect me. I got these things done. Well, now they go to the primary electorate and they say, you should reelect me because I stopped all this stuff from happening. I stopped Obama. We're fighting Obama. This isn't as much of a problem in the Senate as it is in the House because the Senate represents whole states. But what you've got, though, is that the Senate and the House are both controlled by Republicans, but it's almost a slightly different kind of Republican. So the Senate will actually get some things done. They'll send it over to the House, and the House will say, no, we're not going to do any of that. So even though it's the same party controlling the legislative branch, nothing gets done. And the reason why is, as I said, the Republicans in the House particularly are playing to their base. So they can't agree on any policy. All they want to do is stop Obama. It's a recipe for just a big, giant nothing burger. And this is why people are pretty unhappy with Washington. To exacerbate this problem on the Republican side, 3 election cycles, 10, 12, and 14, these are election cycles for Congress, for the legislative cycle. The Republicans ran on basically just stopping Obama at every turn. You know, in 2010, they said, we're going to stop Obamacare. Well, they didn't. Then they said, we're going to overturn Obamacare. Well, they couldn't. The Supreme Court said it was okay. They've shut down the government over reckless spending, but it never lasts very long because the reality is the public's not on their side. So all these Republicans that have gotten themselves elected over the last 5 or 6 years by saying they're going to stop Obama, stop the Democrats, basically do nothing, it hasn't really worked out that way if you're a Republican, because Obama's still the president. He got healthcare reform done. He gets a lot of things done through executive action. So their base was really pretty worked up against the establishment Republican politicians in Washington particularly, and even in state capitals. So as 2016 rolled around, you had these Republicans who were really furious. They're older, whiter, more downscaled in the country as a whole. They're afraid of all these changes that have happened in the culture. They think their political leaders have totally let them down, so they're ready for a fight. And enter the Donald. So this is what they got. But I didn't come here to talk too much about him. I'm sure we'll talk about him in the Q&A. But let's talk a little bit about some of the factors that have led to discontent on the left. It's not as big of a problem on the left. I mean, even though obviously Bernie Sanders had a pretty good run at it, our people, Democrats, they love Obama. They're pretty happy with the way things are going. This doesn't work out all the way down the age scale, though, and the main driver of sort of unrest on the left has been among younger people, and then also among independents who can vote in some Democratic primaries. So let's look at what's sort of fueling this unrest among progressives. So young people feel the high cost of a college education in the US. You have to take out these massive student loans. The amount of student debt that's out there has exploded over the last 20 years. So the average student debt has grown 85% since 1995. Wages have only gone up 3.7%. So if you're a 23, 24, 25-year-old, or if you come out of graduate school or law school at 26, 27, 28, you're just buried by student loans. You can't really get a mortgage because they've tightened the mortgage law since the recession. And so it's hard to get going if you're a young person in America. You have wage stagnation that affects everybody, but particularly affects younger people who enter the job market on the lower end of the ladder anyway. These young folks who are millennials, they saw the recession. They saw a lot of their families sort of struggle through it. And if you're a millennial, and chances are you're progressive, you think Wall Street had something to do with the recession that our country suffered through, and nothing has changed with Wall Street. They all got out with a slap on the wrist. Millennials came of age in an era where government really couldn't do anything big right, whether through incompetence or worse. We had the Iraq War. Obviously, that was a foreign policy fiasco. But at home, we also had the botched response to Hurricane Katrina, when largely African-American people in New Orleans were left to fend for themselves. And the government really didn't do enough to help them when they needed it. And then a few years later, after we got one of our own elected president, and he promised to do healthcare reform, we couldn't even run a website to sign people up for healthcare reform. So it kind of cuts both ways. So if you're a young person, you've come of age, you've seen these big things. Iraq War was terrible. We've had these domestic problems, both right and left. Nobody can seem to get anything done. And they can't really address the problems that we have because of all this sort of partisan warfare in Washington. You know, again, if you're a young person in America, you're probably pretty worked up about climate change. What is Washington doing about it? Not a damn thing. Because they can't, because the Republicans deny it even exists, and the Democrats don't have the power to push anything through. There's only, Obama can sort of nibble around the edges, but there's just not much that can get done. If you're a progressive of any age, you're unhappy about these failures to address big problems, and some progressives, sort of hardcore liberals on the left, think that Obama's been too accommodating of the Republicans who've controlled Congress, that he's actually done too much to work with them when they haven't done anything to help him out. In 2010, we had a Supreme Court decision that basically allowed unfettered, unrestricted money into our political system. I know some of you probably think we already had that, but we really have it now. After the 2010 Supreme Court case called Citizens United, which allowed businesses or individuals to basically put in as much money as they want for political campaigns. They can run their own campaigns now. And so what you have in a lot of these races for the Senate and the House is you have these outside groups that may be run by a special interest business group might just be some crazy rich billionaire who wants to get so-and-so elected or take so-and-so out, and they can spend as much as they want on it. And for a lot of progressives, this is it's actually disgusting, right? That the money in our politics has gotten so big that these billionaires can spend whatever they want. And so if you're a progressive, all this stuff sort of adds up to this system, the feeling that like our system is rigged, both government, the economy, Wall Street, nobody's getting anything done, Wall Street gets what they want, all the politicians in Washington are basically the same, so you're ready for something different yourself, and you might be ready for this guy. And it's pretty surprising that this was the guy, right? Right? Even he's surprised. What's interesting here, there's a little bird that came and landed. He's like Snow White, like this little bird came and landed there because everyone loved Bernie. But before we get too much into Bernie, let's take a quick look at the factors that sort of that are affecting society at large, that are helping with these sort of political and cultural trends towards populism. And the internet. The internet and news consumption dissemination, obviously it's different here too than it used to be several years ago, but now you can basically sort of choose your own news. You can pick your own echo chamber. We now have cable channels that appeal just to conservatives, just to progressives, and then to the people in the middle, which is CNN basically, but I'm a progressive, so I get my news from MSNBC. Conservatives get their news from Fox. It's not the same news, right? If you're on social media, which of course you are, social media sort of mutes differing viewpoints. If you've ever gotten into a political discussion with somebody on Facebook that doesn't agree with you, it's kind of, not fun, right? So what you end up doing is you're like, no, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just not going to talk about that anymore. In fact, Facebook is starting a spinoff called Brigade, because what they've seen is they've been very worried that there's not as much kind of conversation about politics back and forth on Facebook because everybody agrees with everybody else, right? Most of my friends are progressives, so we'll post something and everyone will be like, yeah, that's right, amen. But there's no actually real interaction. So Facebook or the people behind Facebook are starting this thing called Brigade, which they're hoping will allow people to engage with each other about politics and public policy and actually look at some differing viewpoints, because you don't really hear any different viewpoints to your own anymore. This is more pervasive on the right, but they're Bernie bros, which was a hardcore sort of segment of Bernie supporters, younger, mostly white men, basically believe what they want to believe. You can do this in America now. All the conservatives, not all, a lot of Republicans in 2012 were shocked that Obama got reelected, because all the news that they watched said it wasn't going to happen. Their polls said he wasn't going to win. And so when he won, they were just like, what? How did that happen? I mean, Fox News has been saying for weeks that he's going to lose. Well, it's not, So that gives rise to conspiracy theories. And we have those on the left too. There was a really ugly situation that happened in Nevada after their Democratic caucus out there, where a lot of Bernie supporters thought that the whole thing had been rigged for Hillary, because they just basically believed what they said, some of the voting places stayed open later. Well, yeah, they can do that. That's actually part of the rules. Like, if you weren't registered as a Democrat when you showed up, you couldn't vote. Yeah, well, those are the rules. I'm sorry. But it gives rise to these conspiracy theories that they're all out to get us. And so some of the Bernie supporters behaved pretty ugly when the Nevada convention was choosing its delegates. So this happens on both the right and the left. The commoditization of political punditry basically devalues all of it. The more pundits there are, the less anyone's opinion really matters, right? We don't have these kind of unifying media figures like we had. This is an old picture, but when I was a kid, this is Walter Cronkite. And he was the longtime newsman on CBS Evening News, and he ended his news program every night with, "And that's the way it is." And it was, because Uncle Walter told you. And that's how you got the news. You got the news from Uncle Walter. And whatever he said, you believed, because that's the way it was. This doesn't happen anymore. So we also have the rise of celebrity culture and reality TV. I mean, look, Donald Trump is around right now because he was the host for 10 years of a big popular reality TV show. He started this campaign with 95% name ID. because he was on national TV for 10 years telling people they were fired. But it's not just, I mean, we have our own folks, and we have, Oprah Winfrey's great and all, but, I'm not sure she'd be president. But their social media interaction allows them to sort of go around what used to be the filter of sort of the national media and sort of mainstream journalism. So Twitter followers. Donald Trump has 9 million Twitter followers. Oprah has 33 million Twitter followers, right? Does that make her qualified to be president? Probably not. This guy right here is the successor to Donald Trump on The Apprentice. He owns an NBA basketball team, Mark Cuban, and he has 5 million Twitter followers. Some people have actually put his name out to be a vice presidential candidate. Why? I don't know. Because he's on TV? Because he's some rich guy who has 5 million Twitter followers? This is Kanye. There was actually a couple articles written during the height of Bernie mania that said Kanye might run for president in 2020. Kanye has 23 million Twitter followers, right? So the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Paul Ryan, who's probably the leading Republican nationally, has 867,000 Twitter followers. The governor of the largest state in the country, California, who's a very accomplished governor, 4-term governor, Jerry Brown, he has 1 million, right? This clown has 5 million Twitter followers. So it's a concern. We've also had the explosion of super PACs, which were brought into play by the Citizens United court case in 2010. More so on the right than on the left, but there are some progressive super PACs that do spend a fair bit of money. And it just means there's more noise and more negativity in the political system. So this chart shows the tone of ads in the presidential campaign between 2008 and 2012. What percent were negative, what percent were positive. It's not a great comparative because in 2008 we had an open seat presidential campaign. We had one candidate who was running on a platform of hope, and we had another who was a war hero. So there was a lot of positive stuff that was going on in 2008. But in 2012, post Citizens United, and then in a re-election campaign where you had, one side is trying to basically get the other side fired. So you had more negativity. But look at the interest group changes here. 25% negative in 2008, 86% negative in 2012. And this doesn't even touch the frequency of the ads, which were exponentially higher post Citizens United. So there's just a lot of noise. It just creates this massive negative feedback loop. A lot of it doesn't get through because it just becomes like, I don't know if you ever, this may not translate, but Charlie Brown cartoon, the teacher in Charlie Brown talks like this, wah, 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 wah. It all kind of sounds like that after a while because there's just so much of this stuff. But what does get through is largely negative, and it makes people pretty angry at their politics and politicians. So this witch's brew has been marinating during Obama's term in office, and it just exploded into the vacuum of an open presidential campaign. So now let's talk about our friend Bernie Sanders. I want to talk a little bit about why he did better than expected, and we'll talk a little bit about why it didn't work out, and then we'll talk about why I think he's sort of a harbinger of things to come for progressive politics in America. So why did he do better than expected? Well, our party system is very weak. For a really, really, really long time, politics in America has basically been defined by the brand or the personality of whoever's running for president, right? That's basically it. I mean, Democrats are generally slightly center-left. Republicans are now further right, but they used to be center-right. But the party system is weak, and it really all revolves around whoever the candidate is. And the fact that a guy who wasn't even a Democrat until a year ago could not only run for president, but do quite well shows you that just how weak our party system is. Also, Democratic primary voters are always looking for like the real deal. They are looking for the pure as driven snow, the JFK, the Barack Obama. There's always out there because we're the party who likes government and we like politicians. Republicans don't. So we actually want our politicians, we aspire that our politicians could be amazing figures, transformative figures. And so in Democratic presidential primaries, there's almost always an insurgent, an outsider candidate who makes a big play, really in the modern era. Going back to 1968, you had Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. In 1972, you had McGovern, who got the nomination and then got crushed. 1976, we had an outsider, Jimmy Carter, pledged to clean up politics, and it worked, and he got the nomination, and he won. But he wasn't a very good president, so he lost in 1980. And he got challenged in a primary by Ted Kennedy. In 1984, we had Jesse Jackson, who ran on a big, he was sort of the original Hope and Change campaign for Democrats. And it wasn't possible for him to win the nomination at the time, but he captivated a lot of imagination of progressives and left-wing people in America. 1988, we had a senator from Colorado named Gary Hart, who ran a great campaign until he got caught with a woman on a boat in the Bahamas. In 2000, we had Bill Bradley, who was a senator from New Jersey and a former NBA basketball player who ran on an unabashedly progressive platform against Al Gore, who was sort of taking over for Clinton. 2004, we had Howard Dean. And then, of course, in 2008, we had Barack Obama. And it's worked enough times to establish this pattern. Democratic primary voters want to vote for somebody who's like this messianic political figure. And why did it work with Bernie? Well, because he's the real deal, right? He's basically had the same political views his entire career. And it's been easy for him because he represents Vermont. It's the second smallest state in the country. His largest employer in Vermont is Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So, unlike Hillary, when she was in the Senate, she represented Wall Street. Like, those were her constituents. People were actually employed in the financial services industry in her state. Not so with Bernie. Bernie's been a consistent progressive, even though he wasn't a Democrat. He's been for increasing the minimum wage to a living wage level, which up until a few years ago was basically unheard of in America, but now it's starting to take hold because of people like Bernie Sanders. He's been, on the front lines for equality for LGBT people since the late 1970s. It was radical back then. He's been for heavy regulations on Wall Street his entire career. So, he comes to 2016 with a very consistent set of beliefs and a record in office of being a pure progressive, whereas Hillary has evolved. Hillary was part of, when Bill Clinton was president, they were famous for triangulating and for sort of trying to find the differences between, or the middle ground between left and right. Hillary Clinton, only sort of came around on LGBT rights in the last couple of years. And like I said, she represented Wall Street. So when she was in the Senate, she took a lot of votes that were in the interest of Wall Street because those, not just the banks, but the tens of thousands of people employed by the financial services industry were her constituents. And she's really sort of a mainstream mid to late 20th century American liberal in that, she believes in a view of government that is, we're gonna work really hard to make incremental changes here at home. We're gonna have a strong presence abroad because America should be a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. And we're gonna make sure that nobody's, doing crazy things around the world. Whereas Bernie also, by the way, wants to have a decreasing military presence around the world and has since 1982, if not before. We also have the fact that Hillary's not a great campaigner. She's just not. She's a grinder. She's somebody that from experience will do a great job once she has the job, but she doesn't interview very well, and she actually said that herself. She's not as charismatic as the two men that she's most often compared to politically, which are her husband and Barack Obama. It's a terribly unfair comparison, but it gets made, and I also think there's some sexism in it as well. It's not fair, but when she gives a speech and the president gives a speech or Bill Clinton gives a speech, like the difference is pretty stark. So she doesn't excite a lot of or engender a lot of excitement among the base. Ever since 2004, Americans particularly progressive Americans, have been used to giving money to candidates online. Howard Dean was the first person to really exploit this, take advantage of it in 2004. Obama did it in 2008, although in both of those circumstances, their internet fundraising augmented a traditional fundraising approach. Bernie did none of the traditional stuff. He literally had 0 people on his staff that were responsible for raising money. He held 2 fundraisers. They should have even had those. After the second one, he was like, I don't want to do this anymore, and they didn't do it anymore. And somehow they raised almost $250 million online. Whereas Hillary, much more conventional politician who came up in the way that you raised money in the 80s and 90s, which was the candidates get on the phone and they call rich people and they say, hey, can you get some of your rich friends together and throw an event and everybody's going to give me a bunch of money and then I'm going to go do 4 more that day. And Bernie was not going to play that game. And he was able to really light this fuse for online fundraising that we've never seen before. And this is one of the ways I think that he's going to be a harbinger of things to come because we're going to see more of this in the future. You also had independents. progressives on the left who aren't necessarily affiliated with the Democratic Party. Remember, we don't really have a Green Party in the US. So if you're sort of an upper income, you know, activist, they're almost all white, these independents, you know, they're not as concerned about their own economic future, so they can get really excited about getting big money out of politics. They love Bernie. And in some states, they could vote in the primary. And one of the states that we worked on was Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, which is a Republican state, but the Democratic Party has decided to open up their party primaries to independents. Basically, if you're not a Republican, you can vote in the Democratic primary in Oklahoma. But in a lot of states, you have to be a registered Democrat. So what we did in Oklahoma was we saw that in our polling, independents loved Bernie because they basically loved him everywhere. But in most places they couldn't vote. But in Oklahoma they could. So we reached out to independents and said specifically to them, hey, you can't vote in the Republican primary, but you can vote in the Democratic primary. And if you want to send a message to Washington about how fed up you are with politics, come vote in the Democratic primary for Bernie. And we won Oklahoma, and nobody thought he was going to win Oklahoma because they're like, the guy from Vermont won Oklahoma? It's because independents propelled him to that victory. Obviously, he energized young people. We talked about this before, the grievances that they have. I just want to focus on two things real quick. I assume this is not the case for you in Germany because you've always grown up with a socialist democratic party. But when I was a kid, and people older than I, socialism was a bad word because socialism equaled communism equaled the Soviet Union. So like you couldn't, Bernie Sanders could not exist as a national political figure during the Cold War. Just couldn't. It was okay, he got elected in Vermont because it's kind of a crazy little left-wing state, second smallest state in the country. But nationally, he would never have gone over because he called himself a democratic socialist when he announced for president, but before 2015, he was an independent socialist, right? He was a socialist. And that's why most people didn't take him seriously because they're like, oh, that's that crazy lefty Bernie, he's a socialist, right? But if you're in your 20s and you didn't grow up in the Cold War, socialism isn't a bad word for you, right? What you know is that government doesn't do anything except for rich people. It doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't even confront problems. So somebody says I'm a socialist, whether he says it or not, if he says we're going to fix student debt that's crushing young people. In fact, he said that we want to have free college education. We're going to crack down on Wall Street. We're going to make it easier for people to buy homes, and we're going to take our military away from all these terrible entanglements overseas, and we're going to focus on domestic priorities. We're going to rebuild bridges and roads. Our infrastructure in America is terrible. It's crumbling, literally crumbling. So all that stuff sounds pretty good to a 20-something. And then this part, no connection or memory of the Clinton White House. So I came of age politically when Bill Clinton was first running for president in 1991-92. I remember all that stuff. I remember how great it was that Democrat won because basically Republicans had owned the White House when I was a kid with Ronald Reagan and George Bush. And then the Clinton administration was good. We got a lot of good things done. Had to compromise, yeah, but that's the way politics works. But if you're 20 years old or 22 or 24, you have no memory of when Bill Clinton was president, and all you know of Hillary is that she's just another politician, right? She was in the Senate, she's been around forever. She's just another one of that crowd in Washington that hasn't done anything. She's part of the problem. So young people were a low-hanging fruit for Bernie, and he picked it. And he won, almost 3/4 of people under the age of 30. This chart, this map is a little old, I apologize for that, because back when the race was hot, there was a lot of analysis about this stuff, but the last month or so it sort of cooled off. But the pattern held. So in the states that are darker blue, Bernie was getting 75, 80, 85% of people under the age of 30. And this is why a lot of people were, and some still are, sort of concerned about Hillary's general election prospects, because the youth vote, at least in the primary, was just not there for her. So we'll talk about that a little bit in Q&A, I'm sure. He was the only alternative, right? I mean, there was a governor named Martin O'Malley who ran, but he was dull and boring, and he dropped out after the first Iowa caucus. He got 1%. Fortune favors the brave, right? If Elizabeth Warren had run for president, she would have done extremely well. She's a senator from Massachusetts, beloved on the left. But she didn't. Nobody else took on Hillary. Bernie had the guts to take on Hillary, and he was rewarded for it. All right, why didn't it work out? Well, even with all the excitement, the reality was he never was able to really expand beyond his white, young base. This chart here, I shortened it because the whole thing didn't fit, but you'll get the picture pretty quickly. These are Democratic primary electorates by race. So in New Hampshire, 93% of the electorate in the Democratic primary was white. Bernie won by 22. Louisiana, these are microcosms. In Louisiana, 63% of the electorate was black. Hillary won it by 48. The pattern holds true everywhere. Maine, Vermont, white states, Bernie wins big. Mississippi, overwhelmingly African-American primary electorate, Clinton won big. And I'll talk a little bit about the reasons for why those folks love her like they do. And same in Hispanic areas. These are congressional districts that are overwhelmingly Hispanic. And Clinton, in most cases, was getting 2/3 to 3/4 of the vote among these folks. So why is that? Well, people who vote in primaries tend to be older. And on the Democratic side, they tend to be more diverse. And these are Hillary's people. Older Democrats remember the Bill Clinton years, and older Democratic women appreciate the historic nature of her campaign. Younger women, not so much. It's really interesting. There have been a lot of media reports about a lot of younger women approach Hillary's campaign just kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to vote for her just because she's a woman. But older women remember the struggles that you know, if you were a woman in the 1950s and 60s, you didn't have the opportunities that, you know, 22-year-old women do now. So to have a woman running for president on the cusp of being elected president, it's the first time in our country's history that a woman has been the major party nominee for president. It's a big deal. It's a bigger deal to older folks than it is to younger folks. And older Democrats love Bill Clinton, and African-American Democrats love Bill Clinton. And the reality is that she's been a national leader on progressive issues for a quarter of a century. Really, I mean, she's been on the front lines, and she's got the scars to show it. I mean, the Republicans have been coming after her since 1991, you name it, but she fights back, and she's always been there. She's been a progressive champion for Democrats for 25 years. And so this older primary electorate knows that and remembers that. Also, as I said before, unfortunately, young people just don't really vote all that much. This is voter turnout by age in the 2012 election. And what you see here is among the younger folks. So red is men. So among 18 and 24-year-old men, about 36% of them voted for president in 2012. Contrast that with their grandfathers. About 75% of them voted for president. So, and you see that the voting propensity goes up as you get older, drops off a bit in the early 80s for obvious reasons, but young people just don't vote as much. And this is a general election. It's exacerbated even more in primaries. Bernie had a lot of big speeches, and the media got really carried away with this. Like, wow, he's getting 20,000 people to show up for a speech, and a lot of them are young people. But that's not really what winning primaries are about. You know, winning primaries are, it's a logistical thing. It's about knowing who's going to vote. It's about having political relationships on the ground. It's about having experience running campaigns. You know, as I said, Hillary's been out there in the front lines of American politics for 25 years. She and Bill Clinton know people, literally like know them well, like I know Mike, even better, everywhere in the whole country. And this really counts for something. And I remember when we were doing South Carolina, my home state again, we'd had this huge victory in New Hampshire, record victory. No one had ever won a Democratic presidential primary in New Hampshire by 22 points before. So we had all this momentum, and there was so much, and money was pouring in, and people, you know, there were more people coming through the door. They didn't know what to do with all these people. And so South Carolina is the next one up. Actually, I think Nevada was next, but South Carolina was sort of the main. Nevada was a caucus, and the turnout is tiny, like this many people voted in the Nevada caucus. And so in South Carolina, we put a bunch of money into it. We introduced him to people there. We had him there a lot on the ground. He had a great message. The electorate, the Democratic primary electorate in South Carolina is majority African American, about 60%. So he was in the black community. Great message about criminal justice reform. And what happened? We got beat by 60. And it's because the primary electorate are old people who know the Clintons and they really like them. And, you know, just putting a bunch of TV commercials up and having them do some rallies and speeches wasn't enough to make up for 25 plus years of being like my champion. And this was a real problem. It became a bigger problem as we went along, particularly with states in the South that had majority or plurality African-American electorates. And then here's another one. He pulled some punches. We had poll data that showed that a very direct, kind of hard-hitting, contrasting message against Hillary Clinton was going to work. Like to say, you know, Hillary Clinton voted to allow the Wall Street banks to get away with what they did in the recession. And Bernie wouldn't do it. He didn't want to run a negative campaign. And he was proud of the fact that in his entire political career, he had never run a negative TV commercial. And he said, I'm not going to start now. So he consciously pulled punches in the face of internal polling that showed that a harder edge message would have done him a world of good. All right, getting to the end now. Why is he important even though it didn't work out? Because the Democratic primary electorate in the Democratic Party, I skipped around a little bit, didn't I? Yeah, all right. His issues were things that Democrats cared about, and Hillary wasn't really as strong on these as a lot of Democrats thought she should be. She is now because of Bernie. Because the issues that he talked about, and when he was making a real run at it in February and March, she had to basically come to meet him on those issues, or else it was going to be trouble for her. So she started talking more about income inequality and the recklessness of Wall Street, and the fact that our political system is broken. He put all these issues on the table, and she had to address them in the course of her campaign. And his campaign is a preview of future Democratic campaigns because the party has moved more left during the Obama years. This chart shows, so this is Obama's first presidential election right here. About 33% of Democrats called themselves liberal at that time. Today, about 10 points more, right? So during the Obama years, Democrats have gotten more progressive. I'm sure there's a chart that would show you Republicans have gotten more conservative. Thus is the polarized nature of our politics. But what's going to be happening is I don't think this trend is going to reverse itself, because as these millennials become a bigger part of the electorate, now some of their opinions may change a little bit. They may, what is it Winston Churchill said, if you're not a liberal 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative 40, you have no brain. But these millennials, and I don't mean millennials generally, they are going to be progressive. They're progressive young people, they're going to be progressive older people, and the country is becoming more diverse. So I don't think we're going to see a return to the days when only a third or less of Democrats call themselves liberal. And Bernie's type of campaign appeals to those folks. If you build a populist movement on the left, like he did, harness the small dollar contributions that can match or exceed the old high dollar fundraising, which he did, this is only going to become a bigger deal in the future, because the internet is only going to become more important to every aspect of political campaigns in America, not just the fundraising, but the organizing as well. And so Bernie showed that you can harness that without all those fundraisers, without all those rich people around, but with a true progressive message, taking it straight to the people, and get a lot of people to give you a little bit of money. His average contribution was $27, as he said, $27. They had 2.2 million people gave over 8 million contributions, and the average contribution was $27. That is a real people's movement, and we're going to see more of this in the future because he did it. This one is a little esoteric, but some of our voting systems in America need work, need some reform. Superdelegates, I'm not going to get into it because you'll go to sleep, but every state has different rules about voting. It's crazy. It's really just sort of ad hoc and catch as catch can. The polling place hours are different everywhere. That can vary by municipality, not just, it can vary within a state. Whether you're allowed to vote in a primary based on your registration varies by state. Whether there's even a primary or a caucus varies by state. It's ridiculous. So Bernie's trying now to shine a light on some of these more antiquated voting systems, and I think that will be helpful. And there is going to be a Bernie 2.0. In fact, he gave a speech today where he talked about it, about really trying to, and he didn't say his campaign is over. He won't say that. his campaign is evolving, and it's going to be more into how do we get more people like Bernie Sanders involved in politics to the point where they can win? How can we harness this huge network of donors and supporters around the country to help change the face of politics? That's what Bernie 2.0 is going to be. It's going to be about trying to get the Democratic Party to a more populist place. And I have some reason to believe that it's going to be successful. It's just the way that the party is heading. So that's the end of my bit for tonight. Look forward to your questions, and thank you for tolerating me on this warm evening.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. You sounded like someone who knows what he's doing, actually. Not my impression only, I believe. So, as always, I'm standing here in case someone wants to ask a question in German, which never really happens, but I'm still here as your bodyguard. So, we're open for Q&A. Yes, just wait for the microphone.
You said I sound like I know what I'm talking about. In the South, we have a saying, even a blind squirrel catches a nut every now and then. So.
Fishing for compliments.
Did it determine the outcome? No, but could it? Yes, and I think it will. Because, so my business focuses on targeted communications, which when I started in this business meant direct mail, but now it means direct mail and digital. These are the hyper-targeted ways to communicate with voters. And Facebook is massive, obviously. Literally everyone is on Facebook, right? Young, old, it doesn't matter. Everyone is on Facebook. And we are seeing that more people are getting their news from Facebook, their information about politics from Facebook. And Facebook, of course, because they know their market, is making it easier for people like me to advertise on their platform and to do, video advertisements and target them in the way that we used to only be able to target direct mail. Targeting that we can do in America is very multivariate, and it's actually kind of scary for Europeans. But we can target based on just simple factors like your age, your gender, where you live, your previous political history, and then on Facebook, the things that you've liked, right? So we're doing a campaign now for a state Senate candidate in Florida. It's not a huge thing, but it's a primary, And so what we're doing is we are advertising on Facebook to people who have liked Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party, anything that classifies them as a progressive or a Democrat, and we're basically sending them TV advertisements on Facebook, and it's very cheap. And more campaigns are going to be using this up and down the ballot. I think it's even more important for lower level candidates who have a harder time getting their message out. Like if you're running for state Senate in Florida, it's, this guy lives near West Palm Beach, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale. It's really expensive to advertise on TV stations there, but you can do Facebook for a fraction of what it costs to do even cable TV. So yes, Facebook particularly. The other sort of social media tools aren't quite as mature as Facebook, but they will. Yes, thank you. That's a great question. Yes, we knew it early. In fact, we knew it really before New Hampshire, which was the first big primary. The Iowa caucuses are the first contests that are held, but they're caucuses, and I think caucuses are undemocratic. But primaries, when anybody who's registered to vote can go vote. In New Hampshire, they don't register by party, so anybody can go and vote in whichever primary they want to vote in. We saw that independents hugely favored Bernie in the polling leading up to New Hampshire, and so we communicated with them. And the messages that they were most attracted to were this anti-Washington message that, the political system is rigged, it's broken, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you're all part of that problem. Bernie's different because he's independent, and they got it. And we won New Hampshire by 22 points. So in other states where independents were allowed to vote, wherever possible, wherever we had the budget to do it, wherever we had the time to do it, we were trying to reach out to independents who could vote in the Democratic primary. In some states, and you referenced this, you'd actually have to change your registration from independent to Democrat. And this is another way that American voting rules are really crazy. Some states it's really complicated to do. You actually may have to write a letter to the elections board requesting that they send you a form that then you have to fill out and mail back. In some states you can go online and do it. Like Oregon, we did a program in Oregon. Oregon is a very progressive technology adapting state. And it's very easy to go online there and change your registration. And you can change it back whenever you want, but it's like a 3-minute process. So we actually did a piece of mail in Oregon, which I forgot, I brought some of the stuff we did, where we were reaching out to independents and we put a QR code on it. And the QR code would lead you straight to the website of the Oregon Secretary of State where you could change your registration. So we were doing this where we could, and it had varying degrees of success. But it was a big deal for Bernie. But ultimately, it was part of the problem for Bernie was that in most of these states, independents couldn't vote in the primaries. But it's not uniform across the country. You know, so like the states where he got beat really badly, like New York, closed primary. So if only Democrats can vote, it's called a closed primary. New York State has a closed primary. We thought we had a lot of momentum going into New York. I think we got beat by 14. And this was another area where people showed up trying to vote for Bernie on primary day, and they were disgusted and shocked to find out that they weren't allowed to vote. Well, they weren't registered Democrats. I mean, I don't like it either, but that's the rule in New York. It's a different rule in Connecticut. No, actually, it's the same in Connecticut, but it's different in Massachusetts, right? It just doesn't really make any sense. But wherever we could, we were reaching out to independents, and we were trying to get them to vote for Bernie. And for the most part, independents were a huge part of Bernie's base. Yeah, no, that's also a great question, and I had a slide on this, but I deleted it because I thought it was getting too long. I do think that we may be heading down the road of a multi-party system in America because Trump has shown that there are really two Republican parties. The establishment Republican Party is they still fashion themselves the beaver cleaver, you know, the middle-class suburban. They're pro-trade. They're there for lower taxes and less regulation. But they're generally an internationalist-looking party. Well, Trump's version of the Republican Party, which now is not the majority, because remember, he never really got more than about 40% of the vote in any of those primaries. He was just running against 16 other people. But, you know, so let's say 40 to 45% of the Republican Party now rejects a lot of that, and is much more populist-oriented. So there could come a time, and right now the Republicans, you know, the establishment, the smart Republicans, Paul Ryans of the world and whatnot, they're really trying to figure out what to do because Trump does not represent their Republican Party, and they do not want to let the Republican Party be branded by Donald Trump, and they're smart because he's probably going to go down to a huge defeat. And what it means is, you know, the fastest growing sections of the country are the ones who are fueling the distaste for Donald Trump. So, you know, Hispanics and minorities, African Americans and young people and women. And the smart Republicans do not want that. They don't want those groups to look at them and say, well, I'm never going to vote for them. So there could potentially be some sort of a schism in the Republican Party. Democratic Party, there's some discussion about this, but I don't think it's real. I mean, the Democratic Party is fairly united. It's a little more left of center than it used to be. Bernie just represents a little more progressive strain. Hillary represents a slightly more moderate strain, but it's still a progressive strain. And I think that, you know, as she campaigns in the general election against Donald Trump, she's going to look a lot better to a lot of those progressives and young people who didn't come around in the primary campaign. And when she's president, she's going to govern in a fairly progressive way. And so I don't think you're going to have this problem in the Democratic Party, but you could really have this problem in the Republican Party. You really could. Yeah. I'm looking for this piece in Oregon with the QR code. I can't find it. There was a bet. Some people made a bet about what kind of adoption we would get on this QR code because nobody ever does these things, but they actually did this time. So I got a nice lunch from one of Bernie's consultants on that. Yeah, more likely the latter than the former. He is pretty old. He's 74. He's up for re-election to the Senate in 2018, and there's some question as to whether or not he'll run again. It's a 6-year term. So if he runs for re-election at age 74, he's committing to be around till he's 80 years old. And so I'm not sure that he's figured that out yet. He is a patriot, and he does not want to see Donald Trump become president. So he may not think that Hillary is as progressive as he is, and he may think that she's too close to Wall Street, or maybe she's a little too militaristic. But the alternative, there really isn't an alternative. So how active he is in campaigning for her will be another story. I think that he's going to turn his focus to this 2.0 organization to he's going to try to engage young people, keep them engaged in the process, and also find candidates they can get behind for local and state offices to really try to change the face of the party. So he's not going to be Hillary's #1 surrogate, or even #2 or 3, or even #10 probably. But he will tell anyone who will listen not to allow Donald Trump to become president. Mike. Well, no, it's a fairly depressing question. Thank you for that. But it's true. It is at the heart of the matter. The first part of the question, though, I do think that Bernie will be representative of what Democratic campaigns will look like in the future, because what I laid out, the party is moving to the left. It's easier now for somebody without those financial networks to become a real player if he can appeal to people, just the people, right? Anybody with a smartphone, yeah, I can give him $10. I believe in that guy. I'm going to give him $10. And if 2 million people do that, then you're a real thing. The second part of the question, unfortunately, I don't have an answer, and nobody has an answer. They call it the fever in Washington, and people say, when's the fever going to break? How is the fever going to break? And I don't know how the fever is going to break, because I work in politics, I work in campaigns, it's what I do. Republicans, I've watched this happen over the last 10 years. Republicans have gotten more and more conservative. Democrats have only recently gotten more liberal, but they've gotten more liberal. But the real problem is in the way that our election districts are drawn for the House of Representatives, because this process that allows the politicians, whoever controls the state legislative branch, can write the maps, draw the maps the way they want to, and they draw the maps to maximize their own power. And so what that means is that you have these hyper-partisan districts where, say Florida, for instance. Florida is a 50-50 state, right? In the last 3 or 4 presidential elections, Florida has basically been 50-50. But Republicans have 2 times the number of congressional districts in Florida than Democrats do. Well, that just doesn't fit. The reason why is because they've drawn these maps to maximize the Republicans' control. And so Florida keeps sending more Republicans back to Washington than Democrats, and those Republicans won't compromise with the Democrats. One of the big things that I try to work on is this idea of reforming the way that our political districts are drawn. That's a very esoteric issue, and most people don't get it, and they don't listen to it. So I don't know. I think, unfortunately, sometimes the only things that really snap people out of this kind of stupor are major tragedies. 9/11 brought the political culture in Washington together as it really hadn't been in a long time. And I hope that it doesn't take something like that, but it is a fairly depressing picture. And Hillary presidency, by the way, will not exactly be, I remember in 2008 I supported Hillary over Obama, and I was with some friends who supported Obama, and they said, well, we're not supporting Hillary because the Republicans hate her, and they control the Senate and the House, and they're never going to give her anything. And Obama's different, and he's new. And I was like, you guys are so naive. They're not going to give him anything either. And they didn't. But, so Hillary's probably going to be president, and she's going to have to, now, what will change, though, here's one thing. It's a little bit of a processy thing. If Hillary wins, there's almost no way that Democrats don't take the majority in the Senate. It's where these elections are. They're in states that, and people don't split their tickets voting anymore. Used to be a lot of people would vote for one party for president, one party for Senate. That just doesn't happen as part of the increasing polarization of our politics. People just go and they vote, I vote for the Democrat up and down the ticket. So if Hillary wins, the Democrats are going to control the Senate, but not by a lot. We'll probably have a 52, maybe a 53 seat majority. But what's going to happen is there's this whole filibuster thing that some people may know of that allows a minority in the Senate to stop everything, basically. That's not written into the Constitution, that's just a rule. And the rules change at the beginning of each legislative term. So nobody has ever gotten rid of the filibuster before because it's sort of seen as like a drastic measure. But it's never been this bad before, where literally 1 or 2 senators can stop anything from happening because, well, maybe they're running for president and they're trying to curry favor with their primary electorate. So I think the Democrats will get rid of the filibuster rule, which will allow legislation to go through the Senate with a simple majority. And then it's going to go to the House, which is going to still be controlled by Republicans because of the way these districts are drawn. But if the election goes as I think it was going to go, Trump's going to lose badly. There's going to be a down ticket effect on Republicans. They'll lose at every level, basically. So the Democrats will gain seats in the House, not enough to have a majority. But it's going to be close enough that the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who actually does want to accomplish something in his life, will be forced to try to get some of his Republicans to say, there's going to be a lot of compromise. I don't think that, that the stuff that's going to come out and necessarily is going to make people like Bernie Sanders happy, but something's going to happen because it just kind of has to. And the converse is true too, by the way. If for some reason Trump happens to win, a lot's going to happen because the Republicans will control everything. So I think that this election is it's going to tighten things up a bit. But I actually do think Hillary's going to surprise a lot of people. When she got to be a United States Senator, she made a point of going around and getting to know all of the older Republican members, even the same ones who had like persecuted her during the Clinton White House years and the campaigns. And she like worked it like a good politician does, like sat down and they talked about their families and their grandkids and all that kind of stuff. And people were like, wow, I didn't know she could be like this, you know? But she's going to do that as president. And I think people are going to be surprised. Again, she doesn't interview for the job very well, but I think she's going to do a really good job at the job. Yeah, well, the problem is that takes a lot of time, right? And she's been out there since the 1980s, and now, and had an unsuccessful run 8 years ago, and now it's finally coming to fore. It just takes a long time. It is a lot, I mean, like Bernie was a phenomenon for 3 months, but he didn't win. And so he raised $250 million and he got 2 million people to give him money, but he didn't win. So, but it takes, that's why the Bernie folks and Bernie are thinking about how do we build on this, because it doesn't just happen overnight, as Hillary has shown. It just takes a lot of time and cultivating these relationships. I mean, it's old-fashioned, but like when you have these primaries or caucuses is where like your neighbors, a group of your neighbors will come in and you'll get together and you'll talk about politics and everyone has to stand up and say who they support and why. Like, she's written those people handwritten notes over the years, right? It just takes a long time, but it's a really good point that it's a lot of like hard work. It's not going to get a lot of headlines, and you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time because she's doing all that stuff while she's the U.S. Senator from New York, or she wasn't doing it while she was Secretary of State because that is a non-political job, but it's hard. But it's like politics really comes down to a lot of like unsexy things. It really is about like, do you have enough people to make the phone calls, or do you have people to drive the vans? Do you have people to go knock on the doors? Party building is not an easy thing, and it doesn't just appear overnight just because of the internet. But the internet is helping build these networks faster than they used to be built, I think. Do I agree about Obama? I don't know. A lot of people made that charge about Hillary, and it stuck. How to get money out of politics? It's very difficult as long as the Supreme Court is comprised of the members that it has now. But there's an opening on the Supreme Court. We had the very conservative justice who died a few months ago, and the Republicans, which is what they do, have refused to even have a hearing about the nominee that Obama put forward, which is going to really come back to bite them because when Hillary's president, she's going to nominate a much more progressive liberal nominee, and they're going to have to take it. So how to get money out of politics? The Bernie campaign is actually a really nice, instructive lesson about how to possibly do it. It's, he didn't call the rich people on the phone and say, can you get rich people together and give me money? It was really like building a people's movement and going out and asking regular people to give him $5, and they did, because they believed in his message. With Hillary, you know, obviously she operates a little differently, and I think it's probably, so I'm not sure she's going to run for re-election. She's going to be 73 years old 4 years from now, so she may not run for re-election, and if that's the case, then we're going to probably have a big, boisterous primary on the Democratic side, and there'll be a number of Bernies who are trying to raise money and fund their campaigns the way Bernie did. It could possibly be that Hillary is the last of that kind of politician that did the traditional fundraising, but the money in politics is a terrible thing in American politics. It has distorted the system, but the Supreme Court said it was okay, and really the only way to change that is to have different Supreme Court justices. But Bernie's campaign, I think, gives hope to a lot of people that you could actually run a campaign in a different way. I mean, he raised $200 million just from regular people. So that's pretty cool, right? I mean, that's something to be optimistic about. But it is generally, I agree with you, it is generally a problem, for sure. But it keeps someone like me employed, so it's not all bad.
Thank you very much. It was really wonderful to have you here. Rare treat for us.
Thank you.
The way you educated us. What I forgot to say when I thanked everyone from the Institute, thank you for everyone who was coming here. And see you in 2020 maybe. And goodbye.